Good morning, everyone. Hello. Selamat pagi. Hello, vanakkam. Ni hao. In New Zealand, we would say, no mai haere mai ki te whānau o te Singapore University of Social Sciences. Tēnā koutou, mena nui araha kia koutou. So in the first language of New Zealand, that means I welcome you and I greet you with warmth and love from my heart. Thank you to Singapore University of Social Sciences, our distinguished guests, to my dear colleague Serene Lim and the organisers of this conference for inviting me to visit Singapore and to be with you today. It's 15 years since I've been in Singapore. In many ways it's changed a lot, in some ways it hasn't changed at all. And one of the things that hasn't changed, I can see, is the warmth and the energy and the enthusiasm of early childhood educators. So you might be thinking, what has leadership development got to do with rethinking play and learning and joyful experiences? Well, I don't think you can develop joyful experiences for children unless you can develop your team. And I don't think that leaders can develop teams unless they themselves have support with their professional development as leaders. So I want to lead you through some work that, as our MC said, I'll need the next slide, please. Oh, there we go. That, as the MC introduced, was funded by the Australian Research Council and was in collaboration with several universities. At that time, I was at Australian Catholic University. So although I'm a New Zealander, I've only been back in New Zealand for about 3 months. So I kind of feel I'm here under false pretences as a New Zealander. I've spent the last 20 years at Monash University and at Australian Catholic University. And this study was also a collaboration with the University of Sheffield in the UK. So this is the problem that we started with, and I'm interested to know, is this also the picture that one might paint of leadership and of service development in Singapore? So we know that effective leadership matters. We know in any business enterprise and in any non-business enterprise that leadership is critical to success. And we know that there's a relationship between effective leadership and children's learning, but how do leaders actually make that happen? We kind of accept it as a fact, but it's a bit of a black box. What happens in between effective leadership and children's development? And this is particularly challenging in early childhood because it's a sector where, in the main, we've focused on the development of individuals. We go to university or college and we get an individual diploma or degree. Then we work with our staff and we try to induct and mentor them as individuals and support them in their individual development. When actually what we're engaged in is a collective enterprise. We talk about teams all the time, and that's why I want to start by saying, I'm sorry, but based on this research, it's not about teamwork. I'll come back to that point. But what the participants in our research told us right from the start was, I'm trying to build teamwork. I'm trying to get everybody on the same page. But actually it's really difficult to get everybody on the same page when everybody keeps moving on to a different centre. Is this an issue in Singapore, that you have staff turnover? So the team is never quite 100% stable. And there will be a mixture of qualifications and a mixture of experiences and a mixture of cultural backgrounds. There are also really high demands on emotional labour in early childhood services, and this can make it complicated to develop teamwork or the myth of teamwork, when there's a lot of emotional pressure on staff. The other thing that's characteristic of early childhood services, and remember I'm speaking here about England and Australia, I'm not going to make claims for Singapore, but there are relatively weak cultures of professional learning. When you think about the amount of professional learning that goes into schools, it's really quite modest in early childhood by comparison. And partly that's because there isn't enough non-child contact time when the teachers can work together and work on their development. And also there's mixed market provision, and this is even more the case in Singapore than in Australia and New Zealand. So there are very variable expectations and working conditions for staff. So we started with this definition that we called learning-rich leadership. Learning-rich leadership is a particular set of characteristics, and we wanted to test whether learning-rich leadership could be developed through a research intervention. So this was our hypothesis, that learning-rich leadership begins in the learning of the leader, but it fosters the learning of teams, and evidence of the success of that leadership is seen in changes in practice. Now, we were particularly concerned about changing practice to raise quality, and so the centres we were working with had been judged by the state regulators as being below quality, below the national standard. And so we figured if we can lift quality through this intervention in the centres that are struggling the most, it'll probably work in any centre. That was our assumption, one of the assumptions we wanted to test. So what we wanted to do was gather the scientific evidence that would show us how this concept of learning-rich leadership could improve quality. And what we did was to develop a theorisation of learning-rich leadership, and I want to walk you through that today. And those of you who come to my work, this is my ad break, come to my workshop, because in the workshop we'll be working through lots of practical examples of how to use the model in your centre. So I'm going to concentrate on this first research question. How can we lift quality through leaders taking a system-level view? And by system, I mean the centre. I don't mean the whole early childhood system. So seeing the centre as a system rather than trying to change the teaching of individual teachers one at a time. Because, and this is the myth of teamwork, in our pilot work and in our baseline work in the main project, when leaders talked about teamwork, they actually weren't talking about developing the team. They were talking about getting all the individuals to be the same so that there was consistency, and they used this phrase, on the same page, all the time, and they felt they could never move forward because they'd just get people working the way they wanted, and then someone would leave and, oh my goodness, and then they go and have babies. I mean, for goodness sake. So this is the first research question that I'll concentrate on today. My human clicker is working well. So just briefly, how we actually conducted the research. In the first phase, because we were comparing English policy and Australian policy, we did interviews in England and Australia. And the reason for that is that in Australia, we say, if you want to know what education policy in Australia is going to be, look at the policy in England and wait. Because there's been so much policy borrowing from the UK into Australia, and to some extent into New Zealand, and I suspect some into Singapore as well. So that gave us a baseline. Now, I should explain that I'm talking here about two kinds of leaders. I'm talking about leaders who are centre directors, and so they have lots of managerial responsibility. But I'm also talking about what in Australia we call educational leaders. This is the pedagogical leader, and under Australian law, every centre has to have a named pedagogical leader. They're called the educational leader. Now, sometimes they're the same person, and that is a killer job, to have two leadership positions in one person. And I can see some of you nodding because I suspect that you have two jobs, that you're the managerial leader, but you're also trying to lead the development of the curriculum and the team. All my respect to you. That is hard going. It's a big job. So, in phase 2, we made an intervention and we worked with 10 centres, some in Darwin, some in Melbourne, who had been judged as below quality. Now, this was the model that we used. And this model comes from the work of a Finnish researcher by the name of Yrjö Engström and his colleagues at the University of Helsinki. I'm just going to pause briefly, partly because you've been sitting for an hour already, but also because I don't know what time I'm supposed to stop. And I'm going quite fast through my slides. And if I finish early, it's going to be community singing. Someone tell me what time I'm meant to stop. Serene? Don't say you're going fine, that doesn't help. I've got 15 more minutes. Thank you. And I have a watch, so all good. Have a chance to have a little wriggle? Okay, just a little one. So some of you will look at this and think, oh, well, that's just action research. We've seen this before. This is just, professional inquiry model. Well, yes, up to a point, but there's another component to the model, which I'll introduce on the next slide, but not yet. I want you to just look at the right-hand side of this model, where it goes from questioning to analysis to modelling a new solution. And one of the things that we found in the work that we did leading up to the big grant, the Research Council grant, one of the things we found was that centres very often jumped from identifying the problem or the need to attempting a solution. That insufficient time was spent in that stage 2 of actually analysing what is this problem, why is it a problem, where did it come from, what attempts have been made in the past to try to change our practices. And when I say problem, I'm really talking about opportunities. I'm talking about problems of practice that you want to change and develop. So in addition to the cycle of development and change and consolidation of the new practice, we taught the research participants how to use this model. Now, this is a model of what we call an activity system. So your centre is a system of activity. And really it's a picture of your centre's culture. So your centre will be working towards an outcome, and pretty much all centres will say that they're working towards the flourishing of the children and the families, the children's development, their well-being and so forth. And these kinds of outcomes are very clearly laid out in our curriculum documents. But in order to meet those outcomes, every day your centre has to work on dozens and dozens and dozens of tasks, and we call these objects. So these are the objects that make sense to you as early childhood educators. So we want to have streamlined routines, and we want to have rich learning experiences, and we want to have safe outdoor play, and we want to have warm relationships with the children. These are all objects that you are working on all the time, sometimes several objects at once in your centre. When you're working on those objects, it isn't something that's just sprung forth from your mind, because you have training and experience. And so in the centre system, you will have many instruments that you use that mediate the relationship between you, the subject, and in this case it's a team, not an individual, the collective subject. That when you're working on your objects, you're not working directly on them. You're always working through the mental models that you have. For example, the roster is a really important instrument in most early childhood centres. When do staff start and finish and go on their breaks? The curriculum framework is incredibly important, because what these instruments do is they give meaning to your work. So when I say the word scaffolding, now everyone in this room immediately thinks of a pedagogical strategy. But if I say scaffolding to my mother, she thinks I'm building something. So this is about the particular meanings that these concepts and these tools have that shape and direct our work on those objects. But centres also have rules, and sometimes those rules contradict each other. One of the things that surprised me when I first went to Australia and I was visiting kindergartens and making the practicum visits was that I would see signs outside kindergartens that said parents are always welcome to drop in. And then I would see a sign that said the gate is locked, please telephone for access. Now, of course, these are both rules. The gate stays locked is a rule, parents are welcome is a rule. But this is a contradiction, yes? And so it's not a problem to be solved, it's an opportunity to develop new practices. How do we think differently? Of course, that was a long time ago. Now we just tell the parents the passcode. But back then, they had to phone to get into the centre. And it was strange because I never saw that in New Zealand. In New Zealand, parents just walked in. So again, these are different cultural systems. Obviously, there's a community of stakeholders, the children being the most important community. And then there's a division of labour. Who does what? Who's the leader? Who's the room leader? Who's the assistant? And when do they do what they do and how do they do it? This division of labour also shapes and moulds the way we work. So you see the arrows go in every direction. Everything is interacting with everything else. Everything is influencing and mediating everything else. And this is why centres are such dynamic systems. And it's always at this point when I kind of want to lie down and think, oh, I'm exhausted just looking at that. You see the dynamism of your centre and how complex your work is. And I just want to echo the minister in terms of the public discourse of early childhood, and well, the children play and they learn through their play, but we know that working in an early childhood service is incredibly complex, dynamic work. All of these factors interacting with each other. So, what did we teach the leaders? Well, we taught them to look for the points where one part of the system was in tension with another part. Maybe a rule contradicting a rule, or maybe there's a rule that's contradicted by the division of labour. My favourite example is the rule that says, if you want something discussed at the staff meeting, put it on the whiteboard. But the division of labour is that the centre director decides what gets discussed at the staff meeting. So you can't have both of those working at the same time. I see a few smiles, so I'll move on. Can also be that you have a tool that isn't meeting your object, it's in contradiction with your object. Maybe you're using an assessment tool that doesn't achieve your object of communicating more effectively with the parents. Or maybe it's a great tool for communication, but it's too much work. that the staff can't maintain the use of the tool because of the demands that it makes on their time. So we get into these contradictory situations, and those are opportunities for development. So what we did, we worked with the 10 centres for a year, and we reported each of their programs of development and the development of the leaders through detailed case studies and then analysis across the cases. And this is the theoretical framework we used, cultural historical activity theory. You don't need to know that. And we used a variety of analytic methods to identify what was it across the 10 centres that characterised learning-rich leadership for quality improvement. And this is what we found. So first of all, learning-rich leadership focuses on the work to be done, not on individual people. Now, this seems really counterintuitive for early childhood because we're all about people, we're all about relationships. Isn't it about our work with our teams and our individual teachers? Well, actually, no. It's about saying, what are we here for? What are the tasks that we need to complete in order to achieve our desired outcome? We also found that where change was successful, the leaders were able to maintain a story about what was happening. Remember when we had that problem and now we do this and this is happening now and how do you think we should... So that for staff who are down in the weeds every day with the children and trying to just keep a step ahead of everything, sometimes these processes of change are really kind of, they're not visible to them. But what leaders can do, learning-rich leaders can do, is to say, hey, look at how we're developing. Do you remember when? And now isn't it better? The third thing that they do is that the leaders accepted that the goals were constantly changing. And I think this is one of the most exhausting aspects of leadership. You think you're working on something and then it kind of slips out of your grip, or it jumps tracks and it becomes another task that you need to work on before you can achieve the first task. And so this mutability, this constant change of what you're working on. But leaders can hold it together as the goals change. Sometimes it changes because there's a new curriculum framework introduced or the regulations change. What we found learning-rich leaders do is that they tap into the creativity that's in the team. They don't worry about qualifications or experience or cultural backgrounds. What they say is everyone has something to contribute. And so when someone says, or the leader says, how do you think we might resolve that contradiction of, we've got the gate locked, but then we say we want the parents to... The leader doesn't come with a preconceived answer. They say to the team, what are your thoughts? And when someone makes a suggestion, they don't say, well, do we all like that suggestion? What they say is, thank you. Any other suggestions? Great. Any other suggestions? And actually draw out the ideas and the creativity of the whole team. And then the whole team has got the material to work with. We also found that the leaders found ways to make sense of important cultural tools like centre accreditation processes in ways that were local to them. Is that 10 minutes or 10 seconds? 10 minutes. Oh, that's good. So these high leverage tools like the regulations, qualifications frameworks, they are very powerful mediators of our work. And what leaders were able to do was to contextualise these and say, this is what it means for our centre. So they're not saying, well, there's an accreditation framework out there and we kind of have to work to the test. What they're able to do is to say, there's a framework out there, what does it mean for us? And how do we represent ourselves in this process? And the other thing that learning-rich leaders were able to do was keep track of how practice was changing. in the centre? What are the new cultural norms that we're developing? So let me move on to why we saw, so this is the how of learning rich leaders. Let me lead you now through why we think we saw it working so effectively. So first of all, for the leaders, it was kind of the death of their ego. They didn't have to be the all-knowing superwoman, because that was burning them out, quite frankly, the feeling that they always had to be one step ahead of the team, that they had to be the sort of charismatic person with the special identity. Leaders became people who know how to get the best out of other people. It also shifted their thinking from thinking about leadership as an individual identity to a person who focuses on the collective, on thinking about the system. Sometimes we describe this as, you know, sometimes you're on the balcony looking down and sometimes you're on the dance floor racing around. A lot of leaders feel like they're always on the dance floor. This model allows them to get up on the balcony and see the big picture and translate that big picture for their teams. So leadership, the fundamental quality of these leaders was that it was their ability to mobilise what was in the room, their ability to draw out the best ideas from their teams. And the purpose of drawing out those ideas wasn't just to try something different. It was actually to establish new norms of practice. And in these particular centres, those new norms needed to be at a higher level of quality. Now, I should say, we didn't set out to track the centres and compare their quality ratings. That's not fair on them. It was several years apart, and they they had staff turnover and so on, but I can tell you that they all increased in quality rating, some of them quite dramatically. But we're not claiming that as researchers. That's down to the work of those teams. So, the myth of teamwork. Well, I don't know if I've busted the myth because I keep talking about teams. But this idea of teamwork as a kind of aggregation of individuals that you've worked on really went out the window with this research. So, a focus on the development of the collective. How did it address the issue of staff churn? Because still there was the problem of staff turnover. That doesn't always just change because of effective leaders, although we do know from research that effective leaders have lower staff turnover, which is not really surprising when you think about it. Because the work of the leaders was to create new cultural norms, staff coming in to take up jobs in those centres were stepping into these new cultural norms. So it wasn't a process of kind of reacculturating these individuals. They came into an established system of practice. And as that system of practice developed, staff could step in and step out, but they were never stepping into the same river twice because the centre changed. The issue of qualifications was overcome by an attitude of everyone being a contributor, of course contributing in different ways. And as a leader, I would expect people with good qualifications to contribute in different ways. Diversity was seen as an asset, not a risk. And I have to say, in a lot of Australian centres, and to some extent in New Zealand, diversity is treated as something to be ironed out, rather than something to be celebrated and seen as an asset. One of the most remarkable things we found was the decrease in leaders' stress, that they reported that they didn't feel they had to invest as much emotional labour in their leadership work. And we think that's because in this model, everyone's focused on the work to be done, not the person that you're trying to change. Changing other adults is really difficult. I don't know if you've ever tried. It's hard enough to change a toddler. You know, they're still open to change and development. But trying to convince other adults to just be more like yourself, which is my mission in life, is really, really difficult. So don't worry about the person, concentrate on the job to be done. It also shifted the main site of professional learning from something that happens out there on a course to everyday reflection on practice in the centre, that is the core of professional learning. And so this requires a kind of reconceptualisation of professional learning as something that's constantly happening in the centre, that teachers develop, overwhelmingly teachers develop in centres, not on courses. Sorry, except of course on ECDA courses where they develop enormously. Isn't that right? And the other thing that we found was that because this model wasn't dependent on having the resources to release staff or to send them out on courses, the resources that were already available were the resources that drove the professional learning. What it came down to was the skill of the leader in being able to treat the skills and the knowledge and the dispositions of staff as a resource and as a collective resource. So, in your Padlet, you've got access to one of our publications, the book chapter at the bottom here, where we talk about this process of moving staff development from individual skills and dispositions to collective creativity. One of the things that really amazed the leaders was that when they took their eye off individual development of their staff and just concentrated on the development of the collective practice, the individuals also developed. Who'd have thought it? I'll finish there. Thank you.